This is SPE Talks Tech with Trent.
This is Steve.
Hey, welcome to the SPE podcast. This week we have a interesting show. We hope it's interesting for you guys. It's kind of calling it a listicle of sorts. The JPT watch list for 2020. We came up with 10 things that Steve and I are going to be looking out for in the next year. Steve, how do you describe this list?
I think it's kind of an experiment. We know we can't predict the future, but maybe a year from now, when we look back at what we talked about today, at some of these story ideas we have, it'll amount to some significant stuff that happened to the year or not.
You had 5 things and I had 5 things, and we're going to kind of alternate between things that we've been hearing the last several weeks that we know we're going to carry into next year, looking for papers, looking for people talking about these things at conferences.
Or in my case, something I'm kind of working on now as a story, but I think it's going to keep popping up. It's our acronym of the year. It's SMEs. It's subject matter experts. Not a totally new concept, but it's all these people that kind of can work in between jobs, so they can do digital, but they also know so much about drilling. They can be the one that helps them automate, works in marketing, works in business. And I guess it means a lot in terms of job security right now, and probably it's going to mean a lot in terms of making a lot of this digital stuff make sense in the oil field.
So we're talking about subject matter experts here, and the industry's always had these guys, right? So what makes this unique for you going forward?
I don't know if it's totally unique. It's just sort of the hot idea right now because digital is so important, and they need these people as the translators. How about you? What's top on your list?
I put on my list talking about Refracs. So we're talking about hydraulic fracturing, refracturing, hitting a well for the second time. And what's interesting is that when we wrote about this and reported on this maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it was sort of advertised as a way to get a second life out of an existing well bore, get some more production. But increasingly, it seems like there's a singular major driver for most people, most operators in the shale world here in North America, and that's frac hit defense. And so they're not necessarily trying to go after trapped or bypass pay zone, which was the original sort of value proposition for refracs. Now it's about, can we protect, against depletion, against well depletion? So I want to make my child well as good as possible, and I would like to prevent my parent well from being sanded in.
Isn't there kind of a fuzzy line here between this and EOR, in that a lot of times they'll punch in a little bit of surfactant or something and try to get them to get a little extra production out of it?
The jury's still out on sort of if that's going to be something that the industry is going to lean on too much as far as putting the surfactants in. So really it's about repressurizing the reservoir. And I think that adding the chemicals to maybe enhance production thereafter, that's still something that we don't hear a whole lot about, but it certainly could play in. When we talk about preloading, we know that some people are going just below sort of what would define a refracture. So they're loading 10,000 to 50,000 barrels of water into a well, not trying to frack it, but just trying to put water down there. And there are cases where people that are putting surfactants in that, when they reload or unload the wells, they actually do see improved oil performance. BHP had a paper, a very widely read paper on preloading, and they talked about how they did preloads with no surfactants and with surfactants, and all of the wells with surfactants came on stronger.
Yeah, I've heard some of the same things. It seems like it's a short-term thing, but it works for a while. It kind of segues into what I'm talking about next, which is black gunk.
This is number 3 on our list of 10 things, so black gunk.
That's right. Engineers, you need to keep the count going. Yeah, black gunk is just this mystery, this black kind of gunk comes up at certain wells, and the industry's been trying to figure out what it is.
When does it come up?
It comes up oftentimes after fracturing during flowback, and they're seeing this stuff that looks like it's broken down chemicals of some sort or another. One theory that was offered at the ERTEC in August was that it was a breakdown of the gels that they put in there. The
cross-link gels.
Yeah, cross-link gels, or probably actually the high doses of friction reducers they put in. What's interesting to me is that there's other people looking at, are the chemicals that are put in during drilling or fracturing causing damage to the fractures themselves? Is there an opportunity here? When they dig up fractured rock, it tends to be pretty dirty, and so perhaps there's a way that you can, either at the time you treat the well or afterwards, clean it up. And maybe that relates to that surfactant effect that people see.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. We know that people are talking about sort of the chemical changes that are actually happening in the fractures over time. It totally makes sense, though, when you think about, asphaltene buildups and paraffin buildups, and then obviously you're putting down sticky gels and sticky cross friction reducer, and it's gonna gunk up. But we also seen. I remember there was a case in Canada in the Montney Shale, I believe, with Cambria, an oil company up there, independent, that when they would have a frac hit, and these were gas wells, they would see black gunk come up in their production facilities, and that was very unexpected for that company.
Yeah, it also shows another reason why these subject matter experts matter, because all of a sudden engineers have to deal with stuff they don't want to deal with, which is chemistry. So let's get back to something they do want to deal with, fracturing, which is number 4 on the list.
Yeah, so number 4 is split fracturing. So I have to admit, I was actually just at a completions conference, a 2-day event put on by some good folks from Calgary called Saga Wisdom. A lot of top experts there and big-time SPE contributors as well. And one of the things that came up during a talk was split fracturing. We don't even know if that's actually the preferred nomenclature for this method, but basically the word is that some operators in the Permian are working with service providers, pressure pumpers, to see if they can fracture 2 wells at once. So I don't want this to be confused with zipper fracturing, where you're alternating the wells really quickly, relatively quickly, and fracking them, stage after stage. This would be fracking 2 stages and 2 wells at the same time with the same pressure pumping fleet that's on the surface. So the gain for the operator is that you're able to move a lot faster. So this is a big efficiency gain if this works. And you only need maybe an incremental amount of horsepower. So we're not talking about doubling the pressure pumping units on the surface. Use rough numbers, maybe you only need 50% extra horsepower. And then you could complete those 2 wells in a much, much faster time span. So it remains to be seen if this technique actually comes out of the fog of war here in the Permian and we start to see papers about it.
So what are you hearing is going on? Are people using it?
People are testing, and I'm hearing that service companies are, obviously taking part in this. One of the questions that came up during this discussion that I was at was, how does the pressure pumping company make money on this? Is this another way of cannibalizing their profit margin? And, but I'm sure, contracts can be arranged on incentives and, different ways than just day rates. It was obviously a very compelling point for the room, but there was scant detail offered.
Like a lot of things we're working on, we don't even quite know what the name is, much less whether it works. But
yeah, I went through One Petro and tried to find examples of this. There's some mixed terms, dual fracturing, and it looks like in the early days that people were trying to do something like this, but operationally it was very difficult. Now with what the industry knows today after 15 years of fracturing and U.S. shale, it does seem like something, if they can actually do it on the surface and it works in the subsurface, then they'll do it. The one diagram I saw was, trying to get pump rate of 150 barrels, and then use the manifold to split that fluid into 2 wellheads, and each of them are getting about 75 barrels a minute. And so the question is, can you effectively fracture everything at a lower rate than maybe you would think is ideal? A lot of operators prefer to get up to rates of like 90 barrels a minute, 100 barrels a minute for fracturing.
Well, of course, one trend we know will continue is that people will try really hard, make it cheaper to get a barrel of oil, and unfortunately, increasingly, gas out of it, which I guess leads to number 5 on our list.
Number 5 is gas surges. So what are we talking about there?
It kind of covers a number of things, but mainly you're looking at it like the Permian's the prime example. All those flares are an example of the fact that the gas per well is rising. So it's not just that you're finding areas like Alpine High, which were all gas, although that was a surprise for them, but as wells age, the gas percentage is going up more than perhaps is expected. Some people will argue one way or the other, but it's an interesting trend for me in a lot of ways because it shows, A, what's in the subsurface that makes this happen, what is it they're doing by way of completions or whatever that maybe is accelerating that, but it also maybe just shows one of the inevitabilities that this is, even if what is said to be a liquids-rich play like the Permian or the Bakken, is going to require people to adjust the way they do business to deal with a lot more gas and to do it a lot cheaper, because a barrel of gas right now, with all the gas in the world, if it's half gas, it's not worth nearly as much. So your break-even's just got to keep going down.
The financial sector is also concerned about gas-oil ratios, and that operators are doing some different techniques. One thing we've seen is choking strategies have changed in certain areas, help maybe keep the gas from breaking through too early. But the problem is clearly pronounced. I believe the Permian is now sort of the leading associated gas producer, in the United States, and the flaring is attracting a lot of attention. It's also attracting a lot of new technologies. I'm even looking into writing a little bit about what you can do with that gas as far as power generation. There's one company even turning that gas into power to make Bitcoin. And so there's a lot of ideas being thrown at the arbitrage and the amount of gas that's being otherwise wasted.
So yeah, Bitcoin, that's the future.
It could be. We'll see. Of course, Bitcoin just took a massive fall this weekend, but any ideas are welcome as far as solving the gas flaring issue.
For the people who drove down the value of gas to 3 cents or so per MCF in some places or less, I guess the Bitcoin is next.
It could be. One Bitcoin is worth a lot of gas.
I've been thinking about them commas, money in the bank, yeah, money in the safe, yeah, money every day.
So with that, we'll take a quick break. We're going to finish the next 5 items on our watch list here for 2020. But first, I wanted to tell everybody about membership renewal. The Society of Petroleum Engineers is a global community that supports professionals working in the oil and gas exploration and production industry. SPE also supports students pursuing related degrees. SPE members have access to JPT and One Petro, so stay up to date with industry events and enjoy discounted pricing on workshops and publications. We encourage you to tap into our vast collection of resources and our extensive experience, 60 years and counting. Learn more online by visiting spe.org/members. So number 6 on our watch list, Steve, is this one's mine, I think, Texas two-step.
What's new there? Because, I think that was invented a while ago.
Yeah, there's, like a lot of things in the oil field and the shale patch, what's old is new again. So the Texas two-step, I describe it as a zipper frac within a zipper frac. And so what we're really talking about is if you have just 3 stages in a well, you're going to frac stage 1, then you're going to go skip a stage and frac stage 3, then you're going to come back and frac stage 2. So why would you want to do this?
Wait, before you go through, which well are you talking about? There's 2 wells here, right?
No, this is one well.
Okay.
Yeah, I probably confused it with talking about zipper frac, which is a 2-well sequence process.
You got me confused.
But this is inside the same well bore.
Yeah.
To make it real clear, I have 3 stages. I frac the first, I frac the third, and I come back and frac the second. And the reason why you would want to do this is because there's a stress shadow in effect that's happening from stage 1 and stage 3, and it's impacting the stress field inside what would be stage 2. And so to control fracture growth and to control fractures or prevent fractures from necessarily going backwards into the area of the last fracture, you can build this stress shadow and it will keep that fracture straighter. So there's plenty of industry literature that suggests this actually improves well performance. The problem is going forwards and backwards inside the same well is operationally a challenge. There's been a couple of technologies developed to make it easier, but this is still something that would add time to the operation. And right now, time is money, and so people are not wholeheartedly in support of this. But like I said, last week at a conference in Florida, it was a very interesting topic that had a lot of people thinking about how to really optimize the breakdown process.
Was there a production payoff that got them excited?
Yeah, there was a case study. I don't have the details imprinted into my brain yet, but there was a case study from Lukoil in Russia that did it. I believe it was over 100 wells in this case, and they actually saw a really good performance uplift in the wells. Now, the problem was for them, again, it goes back to operations. It was just not efficient enough to justify the extra cost on the surface side for the gains being made down below. But a company called NCS Multistage up in Calgary has developed a technology that would assist people. It was essentially, they call it a shuttle frac. It's a tool that can go into the well and allow you to sequence the fractures. So another term for the Texas two-step is out-of-sequence fracturing.
Yeah.
And that's sort of maybe the more technical term here. But again, it's a time-consuming process, but it looks like the geomechanics support the method. So anyways, I'm going to be looking for that. I think that it might be a tall order for the shale patch right now, but maybe we'll start seeing people figure this one out.
And then number 7 on the list, an idea that unlike the two-step is kind of going out of favor right now. don't call it AI. You gave me the idea on this. Explain what that means.
Yeah, so we've been talking in our cubicles about the different marketing strategies that we're seeing from the software world and to some extent even the hardware world in the oil patch. And it seems like artificial intelligence has become a little bit passé. So we're not seeing people tout AI or machine learning quite in the same way they were 2 years ago. I mean, this is all anecdotal evidence, but have you been picking up on this?
I think the problem with the AI, and there's a bunch of different names of it at the time, it becomes this thing where people think it's magic. And as one guy I talked to with YPF said, if it's magic, we're in trouble. The reality is this is statistical analysis. It gives you an idea of some potential. One of the dangers of AI is it allows you to take really thin statistical data and make something out of it that is something that gives you maybe some clues, but you always have to be aware of the fact that if you don't have a good database, you don't have a representative statistical sample, no mathematical magic is going to save you here. The other side of it is it goes back to that human factor. You have to have people who are going to figure out what this means and what to make of it. The machines are good at what they're good at, but that there is that subject matter expertise that you just got to keep coming back to, making sense out of all of this stuff.
Yeah, so what you're saying there, that was a big theme. I think it's still a big theme, but especially when the onslaught of the AI vendor landscape came looking for oil and gas, a lot of people promised some very big gains and insights without having a petroleum engineer on staff to help sort of guide the projects. Now that's changing. We've seen a lot of petroleum engineers join so-called AI and machine learning companies. But the other thing is once everybody is touting AI, then it's no longer sort of this unique differentiator in your bullet list of what makes your company special. And so we're starting to see different euphemisms. Some people are just kind of backing away gently from even using these terms. But I think the one I heard recently that tickled me was algorithmic decision making or algorithmic based learning, and so people are getting creative and trying to avoid sort of the AI winter for marketing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, as far as sure things for next year, it ain't going anywhere. It's there. It's being built into the software. People are going to use it. They just have to have some perspective on it. Yeah,
and the last thing I'll say on that is case studies. I mean, the honeymoon is sort of over for just talking about what AI can do. People want to see case studies where it really made a difference, where it didn't just confirm what an engineer already thought about the subsurface, but it taught them something that it had no idea was actually happening. So we've seen a lot less of that kind of stuff. So moving on, we have another one. This is item 8. So fracture connections. So, Steve, you want to take a stab at what I'm talking about there, why I put that on the list?
Well, you did give me a clue on the script here about DFIT, but I kind of think that this is another example of people are going to be spending the year trying to figure out what their fractures are doing, right?
Yeah. This one may never go away in my book. It'll always be interesting until people actually figure out how to get X-ray vision and see where fracs exactly are. But there was an interesting presentation recently, and it's going to be presented at the Hydraulic Fracturing Technology Conference in the Woodlands come February of 2020. And this was an example provided by Hess on a pad in the Bakken that they've been doing a lot of work on over the years, a lot of science work. And they did a DFIT, which is essentially what they call a mini frac. You do a small pump in to get some measure of the reservoir response. And they had a producing well 1,000 feet away, and on a 20-barrel injection test, a 20-barrel DFIT, they saw a pressure spike on this offset well. And the room that I was in, a couple of jaws dropped just because this was such a small amount of fluid that went into the reservoir, and yet almost a third of a mile away or a quarter of a mile away, a response was measured. And so that was unexpected for the operator. But it spoke loudly to how connected these reservoirs can be. I should say this was in the Bakken, so the Bakken's known for being a little bit more connected. But nonetheless, I think that people, engineers 10 years ago, would have said that something like that should be impossible.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting to me about it is that there's a paper I've got or story coming out, I should say, in the December issue about the going back to the Conoco testing project down in the Eagle Ford, and they did an incredible amount of work on pressure testing and looking at where the fracs go. And the two things I was left with, one is, as Kevin Ratterman, the head on that test said, nature does what it does. Nobody seems to understand how to control where fracs go. You just put the pressure in and you hope for the best. And the other thing is that there's such a large level of just unpredictability about the whole thing.
Yeah, and I'll give a plug for that story covering Ratterman's work. It's going to be the cover story for the next JPT, which will be issued on December 1st, and so you can go read it online or in print at that point. But what was interesting is I'm sitting at home on Twitter and following a bunch of oil and gas people, and one of them retweets a link from the ConocoPhillips investor presentation. I think it was given a week ago. And in that presentation, about 2 hours in, they actually mention this exact research, and they say that they've sort of made a breakthrough in understanding how the fractures are formed in the Eagle Ford, and also that not all fractures matter. And so they boiled it down to sort of how they were starting to look at spacing. But it was a really cool thing because we often don't see that kind of research brought up to investors. So I thought that was neat, and it was certainly packaged in a way that everybody could appreciate. But this is the real deal research. This wasn't just a quick talking point. So keep look out for that article in about a week.
And one I promised to my boss is that unfortunately coming up this year, or I should say next year, 2020, is the 10th anniversary of Macondo, which of course was the huge blowout that destroyed the Deepwater Horizon. And among many other questions it raised, it was all about whether the blowout preventers actually prevent blowouts. And
right. So this is number 9 on our list. And what are your thoughts about the 10-year anniversary as far as it concerns technology and specifically the BOP?
Well, there's a story. If someone is trying to put together a story, what strikes me is there's always people who come out with better ideas, interesting ideas about how to do things differently, say use explosives, very controlled military-grade explosives to...
Those are the best kind of explosives.
Right, yeah, they have different names for them. Basically the stuff that goes in airbags to cut stuff that's otherwise uncuttable.
Right, so this is like the propellant, right. Sort of like dry rocket fuel.
Yeah, and... all these things are very interesting ideas, but the basic BOP has gotten, the quality is better. There's a lot that's improved, but I'm trying to figure out whether it can cut things it couldn't cut and whether it is that much more reliable. And it's a tough industry to keep for innovation because no one's selling the stuff offshore. So it's a very slow-moving kind of industry that way, and one that people aren't thrilled to talk about, frankly.
Right. Well, just like the offshore rig market, the offshore, giant BOP market's also shrunk, right? And you can tie it directly to how many rigs there are out there.
The world really doesn't need any new BOPs.
But maybe they need new technology. I mean, Transocean's, the stuff you're talking about with the propellant, Transocean's, has taken a leap there and is a first mover in that department. But it also helps make the BOP smaller, right? So there are some costs. There are some ways to reduce cost there. Yeah,
I mean, we always look at. It always seems like research and technology changes so slowly, but the world will eventually change, and. In terms of that change, what about you? You heard about something that seems like maybe it's a little closer in the future, right?
Yeah, so we have number 10 on our list. This is the final item on our list. But before that, I want to just remind everybody that you can sign up for the Jpt Newsletter on our website. This is sent out every week. It has industry updates. We also have an unconventional newsletter that's sent out every month. And this has our top stories on shale developments and links to technical papers that have been handpicked by some of the sector's top experts. So those are 2 really good free newsletters that you can go sign up for now.
We know you all get too much email, but this is email worth getting.
New mail notification.
So yeah, number 10 on our list, the final item here is a new pressure diagnostic that I saw again at this 2-day event in Florida last week. And it came from Devon. And so we've been talking a lot about the possibilities of real-time fracturing, what that really means. There's about 3 different definitions for it. And also for cheap diagnostics. And
so what's this one do?
It's pretty interesting. And so first I'll sort of build you a pyramid of what people are using to see fracs, to understand fracs. And so at the very top, you'll have things like microseismic, whether that's a surface array or in a borehole. And then in the middle, you can have, some other things. You'll have, still at the top of the list, you're having fiber optics, but we're starting to see some electromagnetic mapping come in from deep imaging. And then again, at the bottom, at the base, is pressure monitoring. So that can be a wellhead or a downhole gauge. These are relatively affordable, even though they're still not used in every well. So what Devon's doing is sort of a variant of what we've seen with offset pressure monitoring, except they're using a sealed well bore. So this is a well bore that has been drilled and cased but not fractured. So there's no perforations allowing leak off into the reservoir. This is on the pad. And so what they're doing is they're measuring frac communication, frac-driven interactions, aka frac hits. And every time this sealed wellbore gets pinged by a frac hit, they will pick it up on the surface with a gauge. They're looking for very, very minor increases in PSI, maybe 1 or 2 PSI increases here. And why that's important is because they're trying to track something called volume to first response. They want to know how much fluid did we have to put in the ground to see a response on an offset well. And that gives them, not true fracture geometry, but it tells them how fast the fractures are moving, where they're going.
It's kind of like, is the wave going to hit you hard, or is it just kind of just petering out on the shore?
They're not looking for magnitude here, as much as far as I can tell. What they're looking for is a reaction, and that reaction is what they need most, because that tells them my fracture's there. My fracture is at that well. So now I know how far away it is, how long it took there, and like I said, for them, most importantly, how much fluid. So the trick is, what they're trying to pull off with this is that volume to first response. They want to make sure that they get as much fluid into the well or into the reservoir matrix as possible without seeing that response. And if it takes 45 minutes to see that first response on the next stage, they want to see if they can stretch that to an hour. And what's interesting, what's really, really fascinating about this, and I think what impressed a lot of people as this presentation was given, was that the data lines up almost perfectly with what you would see from a very, very expensive fiber optic cable. So temporary wireline deployed fiber optic cables are like $100,000, permanent installs are $1 million. This is using a pressure gauge that might cost on the order of $10,000.
So obviously it's cheap, and that's a good thing, but what's the bottom line here? Is that slow? Is that longer, slower, or the longer time between when it's pumped and when it's felt mean it's less intense?
Yeah, so the goal is the longer it takes for you to see a response correlates to how much fluid you're putting in there. And that's what you want. You want to see, you're going to see a response. I think in today's infill drilling scenarios where you have wells that are, on one extreme 250 feet apart, a lot of people are still sticking with 600 feet, 500 feet distances. At those distances, you're still guaranteed to see a fracture hit. Yeah. So the thing is, you want to know when it's coming, and then how how much fluid that reservoir can take before you start seeing too much interference. And if you can slow down pump rates and still get all that fluid that you really wanted in there, then that's a great thing. But if you are seeing, instantaneous connections, or you're having with this volume to first response, if that time is too short, then you're running into problems with your reservoir. So you want to delay how long these fractures take to get to the other well. So it's an example of where frac hits aren't necessarily a bad thing, and that it's to kind of borrow Stanley Kubrick here. It's kind of how I learned how to stop fearing frac hits and start loving them, because now they're telling me a lot about the reservoir.
All right, and also in terms of telling, the other thing that disconnects and why this particular one matters so much is it's part of this larger trend that we're going to be following, which is what are cheaper, more effective diagnostics. And then there's a related trend that Trent has sworn off talking about for a while because he's talked about it so much, but it's a really important one, which is, how does the industry then react to it? How do you make sense of this data quickly and build fracturing systems that will be able to adjust as they go? And I guess an understanding, too, of which things you can which variables you can boil it down to so that you can create systems that are practical in a very big industrial setting.
Yeah, so I said it without saying it, which is what Devin's working on has a direct avenue to real-time fracturing. I mean, just the idea if you're going to see pressure hits on a monitor well and then try to delay that response, well, that's real-time fracturing. That's at least one definition of it. So yeah, that's a topic that we're trying to sort of figure out where these best case studies are. This one from Devin is certainly going to catch a lot of eyeballs. It's going to be presented at the Hydraulic Fracturing Technology Conference, the one I mentioned in the Woodlands. So be sure to look up that website and register if you're into fracking. But that's it. That was 10 things that we're looking for next year into the future. Some of them we'll probably be writing about sooner than later, but all of them are great topics.
Some of them will count on fracturing, and there we'll change our list by then. So by the next time we talk to you, we'll be obsessed by something completely different.
We'll see. We'll see. Hey, thanks for listening. We want to keep the conversation going, so please use the hashtag SPE Podcast on all your social media channels. Reach out to us, send in your comments, and use your podcast platform to leave us reviews. We really want to hear from you guys. And of course, we also want you to read JPT online and in print, so make sure to bookmark us and check in for new content. I'm Trent.
I'm Steve.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
SPE Podcast is powered by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, the largest individual member organization serving managers, engineers, scientists, and other professionals worldwide in the upstream segment of the oil and gas industry. Learn more at spe.org.
The Society of Petroleum Engineers is a global community that supports professionals working in the oil and gas exploration and production industry. SPE also supports students pursuing related degrees. SPE members have access to JPT and One Petro, so stay up to date with industry events and enjoy discounted pricing on workshops and publications. We encourage you to tap into our vast collection of resources and our extensive experience, 60 years and counting. Learn more online by visiting spe.org/members.